I sat in that courtroom with my hands folded neatly in my lap, doing everything my attorney had coached me to do. Breathing slowly, keeping my expression neutral, pretending I wasn't quietly disintegrating from the inside out, while my stepmother Diana stood at the plaintiff's table and told the judge, in her most carefully modulated, trembling voice, that I had never been mentally stable, that my father's death had finally pushed me over the edge, that the will he had left behind, the one giving me the house I grew up in and the savings he had spent 30 years building, could not possibly reflect his true wishes, because I had been manipulating him in his final months. She said all of this with her hands pressed flat to her sternum and her eyes shining with what I can only describe as rehearsed grief. That particular performance that looks exactly like sorrow from a distance, but reveals its architecture the moment you're close enough to notice that the tears never actually fall, that the chin never actually trembles, that everything is held in place with a precision no genuine emotion could maintain. I watched the judge's face throughout all of it. I watched it for the small tightening around the eyes, the flicker of skepticism I so desperately needed, the sign that someone else in that room could see what I had been seeing for 3 years. And then, at the exact moment Diana's attorney stepped forward to present the psychiatric evaluation she had spent 8 months fabricating, the judge removed his glasses. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every story worth telling has a beginning that looks nothing like its ending, and mine does not begin in a courtroom. It begins in a kitchen, with the smell of dark roast coffee and the sound of a jazz station playing softly on a countertop radio, and the most ordinary Tuesday morning of my life, before I had any reason to believe that ordinary could be taken from you by someone who had never deserved it in the first place. My father, Gerald Mercer, was the kind of man who kept the same coffee mug for 30 years. It was a cream-colored ceramic thing with a chip on the handle from some long-forgotten incident with the kitchen sink, and it said, "World's Okayest Dad," in faded red letters across the front. I had given it to him when I was 9 years old, bought with my weekly allowance from the dollar store 2 blocks from my school, and he had used it without exception every single morning from that day forward. I used to tease him about it when I was a teenager. Why wouldn't he just let me buy him something new, something whole, something without 26 years of dishwasher cycles bleaching the letters to a ghost of themselves? And he would shrug in the unhurried, certain way that was entirely his, and say that he liked things with a history. He liked things that had been somewhere with him. That was Gerald Mercer in miniature. Practical, loyal, indifferent to opinion, stubbornly devoted to the things that had proven themselves over time. I understand now, more than I ever did when he was alive, exactly how rare that was. The house on Birchwood Lane had been his since before I was born, a 3-bedroom colonial with a front porch that leaned slightly to the left, a maple tree in the backyard that dropped leaves into the gutters every single autumn without fail, and yellow curtains in the kitchen that my mother had chosen sometime in the early years of their marriage, and that my father had never once considered replacing. He had raised me there alone after she left when I was 6 years old, the 2 of us in 3 bedrooms with more quiet than money, and a radiator at the end of the hall that knocked every night at precisely 11:10, reliably as a clock. I had done my homework at that kitchen table. I had learned to drive in that driveway. I had cried in the bathroom with the broken towel ring and laughed on that tilted porch and grown from 6 years old to 23 in those rooms. And when I moved out, I did not stop thinking of Birchwood Lane as home. Some houses do that to you. They hold their shape inside of you even after you've left them, and no matter where you sleep or whose name is on the lease, There is a place that is simply and irreducibly yours, and for me, that place smelled like dark roast coffee and had yellow curtains and a maple tree that needed its gutters cleaned. I was 26 when my father told me about Diana Harwell. We were sitting in that kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in early October, the light coming in warm and amber through my mother's curtains, and he had the expression of a man who couldn't quite decide whether what he was about to say was brave or embarrassing. A slight color in his face, a careful deliberateness in the way he wrapped both hands around the chipped mug. "She's something else, Claire," he said. "Sharp as a tack, funny as hell. I think you'd like her." He told me about the charity auction where they'd met, a silent bid on a weekend stay at a vineyard, both of them outbid within the first 10 minutes, both of them ending up at the same corner of the bar afterward and talking for 3 hours straight. He slid a photograph across the table to me, the kind printed on glossy paper and tucked in a cardstock folder. Diana at a garden party, dressed in cream linen, one hand raised slightly as if making a point, her smile precise and composed and perfectly symmetrical. She was beautiful in the way that carefully maintained things are beautiful, not warm, but impeccable. I told my father I was happy for him, and I meant it. What I did not do, what I should have done, was look more carefully at that photograph, at the smile that lived exactly on her lips and nowhere else, at the hands folded so still, so controlled, like a woman who had long ago learned to make stillness look like ease. They married 18 months later. 40 guests at a vineyard outside of town, yellow roses in every arrangement, a reception that cost, I later learned, nearly double what my father had budgeted because Diana had made some last-minute changes and assured him it would even out. He told me this with a rueful, slightly apologetic laugh. A laugh I began noticing more and more after the wedding. The laugh of a man who had discovered that choosing peace over conflict was, in fact, a full-time occupation. Diana had 2 adult sons, Devin, 34, who worked in something vaguely financial and spoke about it in a way that made it impossible to ask follow-up questions, and Patrick, 31, who managed rental properties and had the particular brand of confidence that belongs to men who have never had to question whether the room was listening. Both were polite to me in the way that salespeople are polite. Surface attentiveness, complete indifference underneath. I made my peace with it. I told myself blended families took time. I told myself I was perhaps expecting too much of people who owed me nothing. I was good at that in those years, at talking myself down from the things I noticed. The first moment I felt something was genuinely, specifically wrong came at Thanksgiving, 3 years into the marriage. I arrived early to cook with my father, the way we always had, him handling the turkey, me making the cranberry sauce from my grandmother's recipe, written in blue pen on a small index card that had lived in the 3rd drawer of the kitchen island since before I was old enough to read it. The kitchen smelled of sage and butter and the particular warmth of a November afternoon when the oven has been running since morning. And for a few minutes, standing at that counter with my father moving quietly behind me and the jazz station on low, I almost forgot that anything had changed. Then Diana walked in. She looked at the index card on the counter, picked it up without asking, the way she handled most things in that house, with the ease of someone who has decided that possession is a matter of proximity, and said in that voice that was warm on the surface and cool underneath, like water that looks shallow and isn't, "How sweet! Is this a family recipe?" I said yes. It was my grandmother's, my father's mother. Diana turned the card over once in her fingers and set it down and said brightly, "The Devon made a wonderful cranberry relish. Much less sugar, much more sophisticated. Perhaps this year they could try something new." My father gave the careful laugh. I picked up my grandmother's index card and did not put it down again until it was in my coat pocket. There were smaller moments after that, harder to name, easier to dismiss. The Sunday I arrived for dinner and found that the framed photograph of my parents from their first anniversary, a black and white print that had sat on the hallway bookshelf my entire life, had been moved to a box in the hall closet. Diana, when I asked, said she hadn't wanted to make me feel uncomfortable. The way she said uncomfortable settled against me like something cold, like a word being used to mean something it didn't say. The evening I stepped outside for fresh air and noticed her standing very still near the hydrangeas at the back of the garden, phone pressed to her ear, her voice too low for words, but her posture entirely stripped of the social ease she wore inside. Rigid, focused, a different person entirely, the way people look when they've stopped performing. When she came back in and found me in the doorway, her expression reset so quickly and completely that I almost doubted what I'd seen. "Patrick," she said before I could ask, "talking about the holidays?" She smiled and went to the refrigerator, and I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I should have, feeling the particular unease of a woman who suspects something and has no evidence and therefore no right to say so. I tried once to speak to my father about how I felt. It was September, about 6 months before the diagnosis, and we were walking in the backyard on a warm afternoon, him deadheading the roses along the back fence. A hobby he had taken up in retirement with the patient pleasure of a man who had finally found something that required only good scissors and the willingness to slow down. I told him, carefully, that I sometimes felt like a visitor in his house, that around Diana and her sons I felt the way objects feel when a new owner moves in, present but belonging to a previous chapter. My father stopped pruning and looked at the rose in his hand and was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that I started to wish I hadn't said anything. Then, "She's trying, Claire. She loves this family. Give her more time." And I saw it. A flicker of exhaustion behind his eyes, something heavier than the afternoon warranted, something I filed and did not examine. I nodded. I said I understood. 3 months later, he went to the doctor for a pain in his back, and what they found was not muscular. The 14 months of his illness are the sharpest and the hardest to look at directly, the way a very bright light is hard to look at directly. I was at Birchwood Lane 4, sometimes 5 days a week, cooking, driving him to treatments, sitting through the nights when the pain broke through the medication, and sleep became a thing that happened only to other people. Diana managed the medical administration efficiently. I will not take that from her. She kept the medication schedule, she spoke to the palliative team, she organized what needed organizing. But there were moments, in the gaps between the tasks, when I would look up and catch her watching my father with an expression I could not name and could not forget. Not grief, not tenderness, not even the pragmatic exhaustion of someone managing a long illness. Something cooler, something that resembled, in its stillness and its focus, a person doing math. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that grief looked different on different people, and that I had no right to police the shape of her feeling. Both of those things were true. And yet, my father died on a Wednesday in March, at home, in the bed he had slept in for 30 years, with the jazz station playing softly in the hallway and the early light coming in pale and clean through the window. I was holding his hand. Diana was standing near the door. In the silence after, I looked out the window and noticed, with the strange precision that shock sometimes grants, that the maple tree in the backyard had just begun to bud. He never got to see it fully leaf out that spring. That detail, not the absence of his voice, not the empty chair in the kitchen, not even the mug beside the sink, was the one that broke me later when I was alone. The tree. He had told me, 6 months before the end, on one of the better afternoons when the pain had eased enough for him to be almost himself again, that he had updated his will. We were sitting by the window, the winter light coming in thin and silver, and he looked at me with the deliberateness he reserved for things he needed me to hear rather than simply listen to. "The house is yours, Claire," he said. "The house and the main account. It's all there. I've been clear." I started to cry, which I hadn't wanted to do, and he waved a hand and said not to, and said it again. "It's done. It's handled. I've been clear." I believed him because he was Gerald Mercer, and Gerald Mercer had always been clear. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral, in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and the particular sterility of a space designed to contain grief without absorbing it. Diana's attorney, a compact, smooth-spoken man named Gordon Ellis, whose suits were always slightly too expensive for someone handling routine probate work in a mid-sized city, presented a document that gave Diana 50% ownership of the house on Birchwood Lane, full control of the primary bank account, and a stipulation that any future sale of the property required her written consent. I read it once, then I read it again. Then I set it down on the table and heard myself say, in a voice that sounded calmer than I felt, "There must be a mistake." Gordon Ellis folded his hands with the patient, sorrowful expression of a man who had delivered unwelcome news many times before and found it professionally manageable. "This is the most recently dated document on file," he said. "Your father signed it 8 weeks before his passing." 8 weeks before his passing, my father had been on an elevated opioid protocol for breakthrough pain. He had been sleeping 14 hours a day. He'd called me by my mother's name once during a conversation and laughed quietly when he caught himself. I looked at Diana Harwell across the table. She looked back at me. Her expression was composed, symmetrical, completely, deliberately still. And somewhere in the base of my chest, very quietly, something stopped being afraid and started paying attention. I did not say anything else in that room. I gathered the papers Gordon Ellis slid toward me, thanked him in a voice I did not recognize as my own, and walked out into a gray March afternoon that smelled of rain and thawing soil. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. I did not cry. I stared at the gray sky through the windshield and thought, he was clear. He told me he had been clear. And I thought about the photograph Diana had picked up without asking. I thought about the box in the hall closet where my parents' first anniversary lived now, in the dark. I thought about Diana standing motionless in the garden, her voice too low for words. And then I thought about something I had noticed and filed away and told myself meant nothing. 3 weeks before my father died, while I was sitting with him in the afternoon, Diana had come into the room carrying a folder of papers that she said were insurance forms and asked if he felt well enough to review a few things. He had nodded. She had sat beside him and laid the papers out on the tray table and guided his hand across each signature line, one after another, murmuring softly, "Just here, Gerald, and here. Just one more." I had been half watching from the armchair, exhausted and half present, and I had thought nothing of it. insurance forms. One more. Just here. I sat in that parking lot and I understood, with a cold and specific clarity that I had never felt before in my life, that I had watched it happen, that I had been in the room, that I had not seen it because I had not been looking, and she had known I wouldn't be. I started the car. I had a phone call to make. The attorney's name was Margaret Osei, and she came recommended by my father's oldest friend, a retired civil engineer named Howard Park, who had known Gerald Mercer since they were both 22 years old and working on the same construction crew in the summer heat outside of the city. Howard had called me the day after the will reading, before I had said a word to anyone about what had happened in that conference room, which told me he had already heard and that the hearing had taken less than 24 hours to reach him. "Don't sign anything," he said, without preamble, in the voice of a man who had spent 50 years solving problems before they became catastrophes. "Don't agree to anything, and call Margaret Osei. She's the best there is for this kind of thing, and she's not afraid of anyone." I wrote the name on the inside of my wrist in ballpoint pen, because I was standing in my kitchen at the time and couldn't find paper, and I sat with the ink drying on my skin and the weight of Howard's words settling into the quiet of the apartment. This kind of thing. As if what had happened had a category. As if it happened often enough that someone could be the best at handling it. Margaret Osei was 61 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of a lie and found all of them somewhat predictable. She wore her silver hair in a close crop and kept her office minimally furnished. 2 chairs, a desk, a whiteboard, and a single framed photograph of a mountain range that I never asked about. When I sat across from her for the first time and laid out everything I knew, the will, the 8-week timeline, the elevated medication protocol, the signatures on the insurance papers, she listened without interrupting, her hands flat on the desk, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have your father's signature on anything dated within 3 months of his death that wasn't prepared by Diana's attorney?" I said I had his birthday card to me from 2 months before. She said that would do for a start. Then she said, "Tell me about the insurance papers, the ones you watched him sign." I told her everything I remembered, the folder, the tray table, Diana's hand guiding his, the soft, murmured instructions. Margaret wrote on the whiteboard in block letters, not notes but questions. Who was in the room? Who witnessed? Who's notary? She turned back to me and said, "A will signed under those circumstances, a man in documented palliative care, on a documented increase in opioid medication, with documented cognitive fluctuation. That is a will signed under undue influence, possibly under incapacity. We can challenge the signature, we can challenge the mental state, and if we're lucky, we can challenge the notary." She paused. "We're going to need a handwriting expert and your father's medical records. Can you get the medical records?" I said yes. His primary care physician had been his doctor for 20 years. His name was Dr. Anand Krishnamurthy, and he had held my father's hand in the hallway after a difficult appointment once and said, "Gerald is one of the good ones. I thought he would talk to me. I thought he would help." I drove to his office the following morning and sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes, and then, when he came out and saw me, he looked at me with something that was almost pain and took me into a small room off the corridor and closed the door and said, "Claire, I've been hoping you would come." Dr. Krishnamurthy had already been troubled. He had noted in his own records that a will had been presented to Gerald for signature on a Tuesday in January during a home visit at which he had also been present. Diana had asked him to stop by to review some paperwork, which he had assumed was medical in nature. He had not been told it was a will. He had not been asked to serve as a witness, but he had been in the house, and he had observed Gerald Mercer sign something while Diana stood at his right shoulder, and Gordon Ellis sat across the table with a notary public he had brought with him. Dr. Krishnamurthy had noted in his personal records, not in the official chart, that he had found the circumstances unusual and that Gerald had asked once, quietly, what he was signing, and Diana had said, "Just the property management documents, sweetheart. We talked about this." He had been debating for weeks whether there was any appropriate channel for what he had seen. He had been waiting, I think, for someone to give him a reason to speak. I gave him a reason to speak. Margaret filed the formal contest petition 11 days later. We had the medical records, Dr. Krishnamurthy's written account, a handwriting expert named Patricia Feld, who had compared 18 of my father's signatures from the previous 3 years against the one on the contested will, and found 3 significant deviations consistent with a guided or coerced hand, and the birthday card. Its cheerful scrawl of love always, Dad sitting in a plastic evidence sleeve like something very small that had survived something very large. Gordon Ellis and Diana responded within a week. Their response was 43 pages long. Buried on page 31 was the first mention of the psychiatric evaluation. I read it in Margaret's office on a Thursday afternoon that smelled of rain and old paper, sitting in one of her 2 chairs with the document in my hands, and the specific sensation of the floor moving beneath me that I was beginning to recognize as the feeling of a new attack. The document claimed that, following her husband's death, I had exhibited signs of delusional thinking, paranoid ideation, and an inability to distinguish grief from persecutory fantasy. It referenced a psychiatric evaluation purportedly conducted 14 months earlier by a Dr. Victor Marsh, a psychiatrist whose name I had never heard and whose face I had certainly never seen. The evaluation, attached as Exhibit C, was 6 pages long and described, in clinical language so precise it was almost impressive, a woman who was not entirely myself, the paranoia, the history of obsessive attachment to parental figures, the documented episodes of what Dr. Marsh called reality distortion under stress. It was detailed enough to be frightening. It was detailed enough that for one terrible, vertiginous moment, I sat there and wondered whether something had been done to me so gradually and so completely that I no longer knew which version of myself was real. That was the moment I understood, at a depth I had not previously reached, exactly what Diana Harwell was capable of. I put the document down on Margaret's desk. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. "I have never seen this doctor," I said. "I have never been evaluated." Margaret looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at me. "I know," she said, "and we're going to prove it." The investigation into Dr. Victor Marsh took 9 days and cost Margaret approximately 40 hours she did not bill me for, because, she said, setting the result in front of me without preamble, some things were simply too important to meter. Doctor. Victor Marsh had retired from psychiatric practice 7 years earlier, following a disciplinary proceeding by the state medical board related to the improper completion of documents for insurance purposes. His license had lapsed 2 years after that and had not been renewed. He was 74 years old, living in a retirement community 60 miles from the city, and he and Diana Harwell shared, according to 3 years of overlapping public records, a common social connection. He had been the personal physician of Diana's first husband, a man named Raymond Harwell, who had died 8 years ago under circumstances that had generated a brief, unresolved question in the county coroner's report before being closed without action. That last detail Margaret told me quietly, carefully, watching my face. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "How long has she been doing this?" Margaret said, "I don't know, but I think we're not the first." The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in September. Margaret had filed a motion to strike the psychiatric evaluation as fraudulent, supported by evidence that Dr. Marsh's license had been lapsed at the time of the purported evaluation, that his signature on the document was inconsistent with his known handwriting from the disciplinary proceedings, and that I had no record of any appointment with him in any medical, insurance, or billing system in the state. Diana's team objected. The judge, the Honorable Thomas Calder, a man of 60 with reading glasses and the kind of patient, unhurried temperament that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking, denied the motion to strike without prejudice and said he would examine the document himself at the hearing. I sat in the hallway afterward and called Howard Park and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Calder is good, Claire. He doesn't miss things." I held the phone and looked at the fluorescent light in the ceiling and thought about my father in the chair by the window, telling me he had been clear. The day of the hearing arrived gray and cold, an overcast September morning that smelled of damp leaves and car exhaust, and the particular anxiety that lives in the body before something that cannot be undone. I wore the dark blue blazer my father had always said made me look competent rather than afraid. I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in the third row and watched the room fill. Gordon Ellis arranging papers at one table, Margaret at the other, Diana entering with Devin and Patrick flanking her like attendants, her cream blazer immaculate, her expression arranged into something between dignity and sorrow. She glanced at me when she sat down. I looked back at her steadily and did not look away. She was the first to turn. The hearing opened with Diana's attorney, a different man now, a senior partner named Clifford Haynes, hired specifically for this hearing, with the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being the most expensive person in the room. He presented the contested will. He presented Gordon Ellis's notarization. He presented the 2 witnesses who had signed, both of whom I had since learned were employees of Gordon Ellis's firm, which was not illegal, but was, Margaret had told me, the kind of thing that made a careful judge pay attention. Then Clifford Haynes presented the psychiatric evaluation. He described it in language that was careful and sympathetic and precisely calibrated to wound, as evidence that I had been under significant psychological distress since my father's illness began, that my contestation of the will was not a rational legal action, but the product of grief that had curdled into something more disorganizing. He used the phrase persistent persecution narrative twice. He used the phrase documented professional opinion 3 times. I sat in my chair and breathed slowly and felt beneath the controlled surface of myself a cold and very still fury that had been building since the day I sat in my car in the parking lot and understood what I had watched happen. Then Diana spoke. She had been granted a brief statement of her own at Margaret's reluctant agreement. Tactical, Margaret had told me, because refusing it would have looked like we were afraid of her words. Diana stood at the podium and addressed the judge with the voice she reserved for rooms full of people, modulated, measured, drenched in a sorrow so well performed it had texture. She spoke about loving Gerald, about trying to build a family, about the years of difficulty with me, my resistance, my rigidity, my inability to accept a new family structure. She used the word troubled twice, and concerned 4 times, and heartbreaking once, near the end with her hand pressed briefly to her chest. She said, "Your Honor, I have only ever wanted to honor Gerald's wishes. I grieve every day that his daughter has chosen to turn this loss into a battle." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Devin and Patrick were both looking at the table, and then Judge Calder, who had been listening with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and his hands folded quietly on the bench, reached up and removed them. He set the glasses on the bench in front of him. Then he picked up the psychiatric evaluation, Exhibit C, 6 pages, Dr. Victor Marsh's signature on the final page in blue ink, and held it at arm's length, the way people do when they are looking at something they need distance to see clearly. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of a proceeding in motion. It was the silence of something about to stop. Judge Calder said, "Counselor Haynes, you've submitted this evaluation as a professional psychiatric opinion rendered 14 months ago." Clifford Haynes said yes. The judge looked at the document for another moment. Then he said, "I ask because the signatory, Dr. Victor Marsh, was the subject of a disciplinary proceeding in this state's medical board 8 years ago. I presided over the civil component of that proceeding." He set the document down on the bench. He looked at Diana Harwell. Dr. Marsh's license to practice was not renewed. He has had no valid license to conduct psychiatric evaluations, bill for psychiatric services, or produce any document bearing his professional signature in this capacity for 5 years. A document signed by him in that capacity is not a professional opinion. It is a forgery. The word landed in the room the way very heavy objects land, not loudly, but with an impact you feel in your chest. I watched Clifford Haynes's face do several things in very quick succession. I watched Diana's composure, for the first time in 3 years, crack. Not break, not collapse, but crack. A hairline fracture crossing the surface of the expression she had spent so long perfecting, a sudden tightening around the eyes that was not grief and not sorrow, and was finally, unmistakably, fear. Devin put his hand on the table. Patrick looked at the door, and I sat in the 3rd row with my hands folded in my lap and felt something in my chest release, slowly and completely, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. The hearing did not end that day because legal proceedings do not end in a single moment the way they do in the version of justice we construct in our minds. What happened was this. Judge Calder suspended the hearing, ordered an immediate forensic review of all submitted documents, including the will itself, and referred the psychiatric evaluation to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal investigation. Margaret filed an emergency motion to freeze the estate assets pending the outcome of the forensic review, which was granted. Dr. Krishnamurthy submitted his written account into the formal record. Patricia Feld presented her handwriting analysis. The forensic review of the will took 3 weeks and found, in addition to the deviations Patricia had already identified, that the document itself had been assembled using 2 different paper stocks. The signature page, with its guided and uncertain scrawl, did not match the paper of the preceding pages. Gordon Ellis, when confronted with this finding in a deposition, became suddenly and extensively cooperative. He had, he explained, believed the will to be legitimate. He had been told by Diana that the document had been reviewed by another attorney, who had since retired. He had not asked for that attorney's name or contact information because he had not thought to. He said all of this in a voice that suggested he understood exactly how it sounded and had already consulted his own attorney about the implications. Diana was charged 6 weeks after the hearing with fraud, forgery, and the submission of fabricated evidence in a probate proceeding. Dr. Victor Marsh, when investigators visited him at his retirement community, told them he had never evaluated me, had not signed any document relating to me, and identified the signature on Exhibit C as not his own within approximately 45 seconds of being shown it. He also told them that Diana Harwell had contacted him twice by phone in the preceding year, and that he had told her on both occasions to leave him alone. That information went into a second file that I was told carefully was part of an ongoing inquiry into matters I was not required to understand in detail. I understood enough. The will was invalidated 4 months after the initial hearing. The court reverted to my father's previous will, the one prepared 5 years prior, before Diana, which left the house on Birchwood Lane and the primary account to me in full. Diana was ordered to vacate the property within 30 days and to restore all account funds withdrawn since the date of Gerald Mercer's death, with interest. She did not attend the final hearing. Her attorney submitted the paperwork on her behalf. I was told she had retained a criminal defense lawyer and moved in with Devon, whose vaguely financial employment I noted, quietly and without any particular satisfaction, appeared to have become significantly vaguer in the months since the hearing. I did not feel the victory the way I had imagined I would. I had imagined something large and bright, a clean vindication, the emotional equivalent of a window thrown open onto a sunny morning. What I felt instead was quieter and more complicated than that. A deep tiredness, and beneath the tiredness, something solid and warm, the specific sensation of solid ground underfoot after a long time of not trusting what you were standing on. I drove to Birchwood Lane the day the keys were returned to me and sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The porch still leaned to the left. The maple tree was bare. It was January, cold and clear, the kind of winter day that has no ambiguity in it. I unlocked the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing in the smell of the house, wood and old warmth and something faintly floral that I could not identify. Diana's last ghost, fading now. I walked to the kitchen. The yellow curtains were still there. I don't know what I had expected, but I stood in front of them for a long moment, one hand on the fabric, feeling the particular quality of a thing that has outlasted everything that tried to displace it. The chipped mug was in the third cupboard on the left, behind some things that didn't belong there. I washed it and set it by the sink to dry. The criminal proceedings against Diana moved slowly, as they do, and I made myself stop tracking them after a while because keeping vigil over someone else's punishment is its own kind of captivity, and I had spent enough of my attention on Diana Harwell. I know that her case was still pending at the time I stopped following it. I know that the inquiry into Raymond Harwell's death was reopened. I know that Howard Park called me on a Tuesday in April and said, "I think Gerald knew something was wrong in those last months. I think he was trying to tell you it was handled because he needed to believe it was." I sat with that for a long time. I think he was right. I think my father, in the chair by the window with the winter light on his hands, was trying to protect me from a fear that had already come too late to outrun. I think the clearest thing he ever did was love me. I have to let the rest go. It is late summer now. The maple tree is full. a deep layered green that shifts in the afternoon wind, the gutters probably filling again already, a job for the weekend. I have coffee every morning from the chipped mug, dark roast from the same local shop, and I drink it on the porch in the morning before the day gets complicated, sitting on the boards that lean slightly to the left and looking out at the street where I learned to ride a bicycle and walk to school and come home. The porch leans because it gives the house character. My father told me that. He wasn't wrong. Some things hold their shape because they're built right, because the bones are good, because what's underneath is genuine and solid and not going anywhere, not for new owners, not for carefully folded hands, not for anyone who tries to guide your signature across the bottom of a page and tell you it's just paperwork, sweetheart. We talked about this. You can take the curtains down. You can move the photograph. You can paper over every surface with documents and depositions and the signatures of notaries brought in from other cities. The bones stay. The bones are always there. And when everything else has been stripped away, the bones are what you come home to. I come home to them every morning. I drink my coffee. I watch the maple tree. I leave the mug by the sink.